Good evening. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Uncampus in Hong Kong, our premier location in Asia, representing UChicago values of free and open discourse, rigorous debate, and the exchange of ideas. Welcome to the series 1.5 Degrees. We're broadcasting tonight's event live via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube from the UChicago Campus in Hong Kong. If audience members have questions to submit, you can do so through the questions and answer button by first registering on Zoom. I also encourage you to visit our website at www.uchicago.hk and subscribe to our e-news for the latest news and information. Or you can also follow us on our UChicago Campus Facebook page. Tonight we continue the 1.5 Degrees Oceans mini-series, which addresses the significant threat of climate change on our oceans. We'll listen to a lecture entitled Tropical Cyclone Activity and its Impact on Marine Ecosystems from Dr. Rut Pedrosa Pàmies, Senior Research Scientist at the University of Chicago Marine Biological Laboratories Ecosystem Center. While her research is conducted mostly in the tropics, Dr. Pedrosa Pàmies will discuss similarities between cyclones and typhoons. For those of you unfamiliar, the Ecosystem Center was founded more than 4 decades ago with the mission of investigating the structure and function of ecological systems and their response to changing environmental conditions, and applying that knowledge to the wise management of natural resources. The MBL and the Ecosystem Center leads the convening of a very large network of collaborators from diverse disciplines and from multiple institutions around the world for research at Arctic, coastal, and open seas sites, now at the front lines of global change. Now let's get to the program. Let me begin by introducing our guest lecturer. Dr. Rut Pedrosa Pàmies is a research scientist of the Ecosystem Center at the Marine Biological Laboratory. She's an oceanographer and a marine biogeochemist focused on the cycling of elements in the environment, especially the biogeochemistry of carbon in the world's oceans. Her aim is to unravel the natural drivers that control marine ecosystems and the impact that anthropogenic factors have on them. She investigates the factors that regulate the downward flux of material from the surface of the ocean into the interior and from there to the seafloor. Dr. Pedrosa Pàmies studies the role of particles in the ocean's carbon cycle using detailed geochemical characterization, including bulk geochemical composition and stable isotopes, lipid biomarkers, major and trace elements, and integrates the characterization of particle fluxes with the analysis of external, climatic, and internal oceanographic forcing conditions. She has a significant interest in issues of direct societal concern, such as persistent organic pollutants and micro and nanoplastics in marine ecosystems, and the ways in which the oceans may be encouraged to remove anthropogenic carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Dr. Pedrosa Pàmies, welcome. We're excited to learn more about your work. I'll turn the floor over to you and then rejoin you to facilitate a conversation and take the audience questions.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this kind introduction. I'm going to proceed to share my screen. So today, as Mark mentioned, in this presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about some of the knowns and unknowns of how climate change might be and will be potentially impacting extreme weather events, the carbon cycle, and marine ecosystems. But first of all, I want to start with some of the fundamentals related to the carbon cycle. On our dynamic planet, carbon atoms flow between the different reservoirs in the Earth. So from the atmosphere to terrestrial biosphere, the oceans, and the sediments, which also includes fossil fuels. I will not go in detail with this, but here you can see a more detailed diagram of the complexity of carbon flow between the different reservoirs. And the numbers represent the carbon stocks in pentagrams of carbon, which is one pentagram is 1 billion metric tons of carbon. And the black numbers and arrows represent the numbers prior to the industrial era and the red ones are the perturbations after the industrial era. The ocean, with around 38,000 billion tons of carbon, contains 16 times as much carbon as the terrestrial biosphere. And the oceans play a crucial role for the global carbon cycling, and therefore for our climate regulation. And this is primarily due to three factors. First of all, the ocean is a huge carbon reservoir. Second, CO2 in seawater is effectively disassociated inorganically into other substances. And third, marine plankton in the surface is keeping the surface ocean CO2 concentration at lower level than would a lifeless ocean. The ocean provides the most important sink for anthropogenic carbon dioxide, taking up about 1/4 of the CO2 that we emit to the atmosphere. But the question here is, what are the mechanisms and the process that make this carbon flow possible in the ocean? Atmospheric CO2 is introduced into the ocean through the exchange of gases by the difference in partial pressure between the atmosphere and the ocean. So some of this CO2 stays as dissolved gas, but much of it is actually transformed into different chemical species that are in equilibrium. In the ocean, carbon exists as dissolved inorganic carbon, that will be the CO2, bicarbonate, and carbonate. And then we have the particulate inorganic carbon that form through process like calcification, like in organisms with calcareous skeletons. And we have also dissolved and particulate organic carbon from organisms and detritus material. There are three main processes that we call the so-called pumps that make up the marine carbon cycle, bring CO2 into the ocean interior, and this is distributed through the oceans. One of them is the solubility pump, where the dissolved inorganic carbon circulates through the whole ocean by the thermoline circulation. The thermoline circulation drives a global scale system of currents called the global conveyor belts. And actually in this map with red arrows, what you can see is the path of warmer, less dense surface waters, and the blue arrows indicate the path of deep, cold, denser water currents. So a major sink of this dissolved inorganic carbon occurs in the subpolar seas where there is a deep water formation. Then we have also the biological pump, which is the ocean's biologically driven sequestration of carbon from the atmosphere and land runoff to the ocean interior and seafloor sediments. And actually this pump is responsible for the cycling of organic matter formed mainly by phytoplankton during the photosynthesis and will be recycled by zooplankton and bacteria. And also we have the carbonate pump, which is responsible for the cycling of carbonate formed into shells by certain organisms such as plankton and corals that can get eventually sinking through the water column. And overall, of the carbon that is produced in the surface, just 1% can reach the seafloor due to that this carbon is used or recycled through the water column. And finally, we have what's called the Continental shelf pump, which are the mechanisms that transport carbon, either as dissolved or particulate material, from surface waters to the ocean interior. And this pump occurs where the solubility and biological pumps interact with the local hydrography that feeds dense water from the shelf floor into the adjacent deep ocean. And there are several factors driving this pump. We have meteorological, hydrological, oceanographic, and geomorphologic. And a clear example where this pump is very active is actually during coastal storms. And the big question is how climate change impacts this ocean carbon cycle and sediment transport, and how can this actually impact deep ocean ecosystems? As you know, carbon dioxide levels today are higher than at any point in at least the past 800,000 years, and the continuous rise of the last decades is associated mostly with the use of fossil fuels. And the evidence for rapid climate change is compelling. We have shrinking ice sheets and glacier retreat, ocean acidification, global temperature rise, warming ocean, sea level rise, and more extreme weather events. And today, as you know, we will focus on extreme weather events. Extreme weather includes unexpected, unusual, unpredictable, severe, or unseasonal weather, so the weather at the extremes of the historical distribution. And in this map, you can see that there are hundreds of studies that around the globe that link and prove that there are extreme weather events that are linked to climate change, which are here the red coloration symbols. And there are multiple types of extreme weather events like droughts or extreme cold and heat waves, flooding, and storms. You can see in these plots with data from 1970 to 2018 from the International Disaster Database that it seems that the frequency of these events has been globally increasing over time. And today we'll focus on the storms, especially about the impact of tropical cyclones in the ocean, which are the most extreme episodic weather event affecting the subtropical and temperate ocean. So let's dive into this topic. Tropical cyclones are extreme weather events that are powered by the evaporation of seawater. It all starts as a small atmospheric disturbance located in or near a tropical ocean. They only form in tropical regions because they need the heat from the warm water to fuel the storm. If water temperatures are warm enough and atmospheric conditions are supportive with moisture and uniform winds, a tropical system can evolve to tropical cyclone when winds are over 119 kilometers per hour. In the North Atlantic, tropical cyclones are called hurricanes. They form as tropical storms over the warm water of the African coast and are moved east to west by the prevailing wind. Each one of the lines in these maps are hurricane paths. As the storm moves west over the tropical ocean, their energy increases, and some of them reach hurricane status. And as you can notice in this large image, all their paths are deflected to the right as they approach the Caribbean, causing them to move towards the north. And this is due to the pyrolysis effect, which is the tendency for the paths of moving bodies to be deflected on the surface of the Earth to the right in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the southern hemisphere. And very similar patterns actually occur in the Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. Although instead of being called hurricanes, they are known as typhoons over the Northeast Pacific and cyclones over the South Pacific and Indian Oceans. And the Northwest Pacific Ocean has more tropical cyclones than anywhere else on Earth, with an average of over 25 tropical storms and 16 typhoons per year, which actually contrasts with the Atlantic, where on average there are about 10 tropical storms occurring each season, with an average of 6 hurricanes per year. And as you can see in this image, these extreme weather events impact extensive coastal zones, but also it's important to note that they cover extensive areas of open ocean areas. And so I hope now this clarifies that a general term for typhoons, cyclones, hurricanes is tropical cyclones. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to use as much as possible the word tropical cyclones, but once in a while I might use hurricanes because my area of study is the North Atlantic, but we will be talking about the same process, which is tropical cyclones. So how does global warming impact these extreme weather events? In this map, you can see that the change in sea surface temperature since 1900 and the predominant red coloration indicate that most parts of the world's ocean have seen a temperature rise. And the warmer the water temperatures, the more heat energy is available. And as you can see in this plot on the right, with the x-axis corresponding to years and the y-axis to the ocean heat content, The ocean heat content has been increasing rapidly the last decades, both from the surface to the deep ocean. And these conditions trigger that there is a higher potential for tropical cyclones to develop because the surface also is warmer, and this rise of temperatures is generating also that the areas where these storms are reaching their peak intensity will slowly migrate poleward. And this rise of temperature also is triggering an increase in the sea level rise. Within this context, it's reasonable to assume that as humans continue to release planet-warming greenhouse gases, the likelihood of tropical cyclone activity increases. And by and large, that's true, but it's a little bit more complicated than that because finding trends in either the number or intensity of tropical cyclones is difficult because reliable records date back only as far as complete global satellite observations, which is about 40 years. And although it cannot be answered if tropical cyclones will be more frequent, even knowing, for example, that 2020 was the most active hurricane season on the record in the North Atlantic with 29 storms, what we know, as you can see in this plot on the right, is that, and also in this plot on the right, you can see that the x-axis is the wind speed and also the category of these tropical cyclones, and the y-axis is the frequency. What we know is that there has been and it will be an increase in the proportion of major hurricanes, so cyclones with that will be more intense. And how these extreme events actually can impact coastal environments. It's well known that in coastal areas, these extreme meteorological events affect many aspects of ocean circulation and land-ocean exchange. For example, generating coastal erosion, resuspension of sediments, huge arrival of riverine sediments, and it can also stimulate primary production by having more available nutrients. Although I have to say that phytoplankton population growth is highly constrained by the light due to this particle resuspension, so the plankton will not have as much light as they will need. Another impact can be the impact in the water quality in coastal ecosystems and also the fish dynamics. And in areas where there are coral reefs, these coral reefs can get impacted due to the strong currents, and these coral reefs actually will need time to regenerate, which can be even up to 9 to 12 years to recover following these large disturbances. The impact of tropical cyclones on coastal ecosystems is directly linked also with sea level rise. And the warmer, as I was saying, as the warmer the ocean temperatures, higher sea level rise. And as you can see with the predominant blue coloration in this map, mean sea level rise has risen across most world's ocean. So sea level rise is likely to make hurricanes more damaging since the storm surge, when winds push towards the coast, will impact more coastal ecosystems and populated areas, generating more coastal erosion. An example of how these events can impact the coastal ecosystems is directly linked with the flood waters. When there is a lot of rain and then there is a huge river discharge, what can happen is that the water quality can get impacted by, for example, increasing the level of pollutants or bacteria like fecal-derived bacteria and microbial pathogens that are arriving to coastal ecosystems where usually they don't have this impact. Additionally, as I was mentioned, there are some studies that show that tropical cyclones can generate fish to temporarily evacuate coastal environments towards deeper water, basically to protect themselves from these strong currents. And as I show in this plot and they compare day and time, and in the y-axis there is the movement rate. And they were studying the gray triggerfish. The evidence of this study is that the strong currents that a tropical cyclone generate in the upper ocean can disrupt this behavior of these fish species, basically causing them to move towards other areas. After these events, there is a high load of suspended particles derived from river discharge, but also from resuspension due to the strong currents. And in this map on the left, you can see an example after a passage of Hurricane Rita in 2005. And with the dark red coloration corresponding to a high load of suspended particulate material. These particles that are resuspended eventually settle and get redeposited. And you can see an example here from Rita and Katrina 2005 in this map. What they show is that the accumulation of these redeposition of sediment particles after the hurricane passages. And as you can see in some of the areas, here the blue columns corresponding to 15 centimeters, there are areas where the accumulation was above 15 centimeters of sediments after these extreme weather events. But how we know that sediments have been resuspended and then there has been a redeposition? As an example here of this kind of redeposition, I want to show you X-radiograph of sediment cores collected few days after another hurricane, Hurricane Lily in 2002. And sediment cores basically are tubes of sediments that are collected vertically in the seafloor. In that way, we can see all the layers of sediments that are in the seafloor. And what these cores clearly show from Hurricane Lily is that there was a basal erosional surface due to the intense reworking of the surface sediment layers during the strong currents during the storm passage. And on top, there was the overlaying the hurricane sediment deposit. But how we can know that actually these sediments have been redeposited after a hurricane passes and their sources, because it could be due to other processes, right? So that's why, to confirm this redeposition and the age and sources of the sediments, there are several tracers that can be used, like particle reactive radio tracers, like thorium, beryllium, cesium, and but also to know the sources of, for example, the particulate organic carbon, there can be done like bulk elemental particle composition and stable isotopes. A key point to evaluate the sources of particulate organic matter, for example, and other elements, is to know the composition of as many as possible end members. For example, the signal that will come from the river, the signal that will come from marine algae, the signal that will come from terrestrial plants and or other pollutants, or any nearby sources that will explain to know the sediment that eventually gets deposited in the seafloor. And these actually help us a lot to create mixing models and evaluate the sediment transport from coastline to the deep ocean. Well, so far we talked a bit about some of the major processes that can impact in coastal ecosystems after a tropical cyclone passage. But now let's learn a bit about how these events can impact the open ocean, which actually covers about 70% of the Earth's surface. In the ocean, temperature decreases with increasing depth. This actually temperature depth profile that I'm showing here is what you might expect to find in low to mid latitudes. And regarding nutrients, what will be the food availability for plankton communities? The nutrient concentrations are low at the surface because is where primary producers are located. Then this means that nutrients are rapidly consumed and they do not have the chance to accumulate. So nutrient levels increase at depth as they are no longer being consumed by producers and they are being regenerated through the decomposition of organic material by bacteria. Within this context, it's well known by now that tropical cyclones propagate over the warm sea surface. Here will be the red coloration, sucking up heat, creating a cold wake behind the storm as nutrient-rich colder water, here will be the dark blue, is brought towards the sea surface by the tropical cyclone wind stress. Here you can see a clear example of this cold wake after the passage of Hurricane Igor in the North Atlantic in 2010. In this map, you can see the sea surface temperature from satellite data. And the track of this hurricane actually would be obvious even without the track line, since there was a very strong upwelling of nutrient-rich cold waters. And this hurricane-induced upwelling of nutrient-rich cold waters stimulates the phytoplankton growth. And here I want to show you an example of the chlorophyll map, which actually the chlorophyll is an algae pigment, and this is like also from Igor 2010, and you can see clearly that there was an stimulation of the phytoplankton growth following the hurricane path. So when there is these events, these tropical cyclones, by stimulating these phytoplankton blooms in the surface, it means that tropical cyclones can affect the ecology of the upper ocean. And since phytoplankton is at the bottom of the food chain, the factors that influence their growth and also directly affect then they will be affecting the animals and organisms that feed on them. And while the influence of hurricanes on surface ocean physics and biogeochemistry is now relatively well understood, the impact of tropical cyclones on the deep ocean carbon pump and deep ocean environment remains essentially unknown. But our research group has been able to shed some light into how hurricanes can impact the deep North Atlantic Ocean thanks to the ideal location of our study site, which is located in the Bermuda Time Series site in the North Atlantic Sargasso Sea, about 75 kilometers southeast of Bermuda. And our study site is the Oceanic Flux program site, and it's co-located with other ongoing time series, which provide very important upper ocean data for our research as well. The Oceanic Flux program started in 1978, and it is a continuous time series studying the deep ocean particle flux in the oligotrophic northern Sargasso Sea. This program consists in a long mooring line that it's deployed in 4,500 meters of water, and this mooring line contains sediment traps at 500, 1,500, and 3,200 meter depth that collect sinking particles continuously at biweekly sample resolution. And sediment traps basically are big funnels, what will correspond here, this yellow big funnel, that collect particles that sink, and the particles will get collected in a bottle. And every 2 weeks, there is a carousel that rotates and to collect the particles in a new bottle. The mooring line also contains an acoustic Doppler profiler, which at the top of the mooring, which what it does, it's measuring the currents at both direction and velocity. And of course, the mooring has also floats and other instrumentation, and the floats help to have the mooring a good buoyancy. And with the sediment trap samples, we can see that the composition of the particles that sink through the water column is highly diverse. Here you can see an example of sinking particles containing phycopellets from zooplankton, shells from different organisms, aggregates, etc. And our lab used diverse chemical tracers to study the particle cycle in the ocean and also the biodiversity of these particles, including, among others, elemental data, stable isotopes, and lipid biomarkers. If we observe now the amount of particles that sink, what we call the particle mass fluxes, that will be here in the y-axis, in this Oceanic Flux program time series that started in 1978 at the 3 depths, 500, 1,500, and 3,200 meter depth, the first thing that stands out in this plot is that the deep ocean is not a static environment at all. There is seasonal and short-term variability. So each one of these peaks that you see here actually is showing you that there is this variability, not just in the surface, but also in the deep ocean. And actually this is telling you that the deep ocean is very tightly connected to the upper ocean. In this time record, some of the most extreme particle fluxes in 1978 correspond to the impact of hurricanes that impacted Bermuda. Like, for example, Fabian, 2003, which was a Category 3 hurricane, and Igor, 2010, which was a Category 1 hurricane, which from this last one I will not talk today, but both hurricanes generated strong currents in the ocean interior that impacted the Bermuda continental shelf and slope, resuspending sediments and coral reef debris. And as you can see, these particles were transported offshore and captured by the sediment traps. And these satellite images image the light blue corresponds to the big plume, with basically they were reef particles. And what we can see actually in this image will correspond just to the tip of the iceberg, since there was a huge plume that through the water column coming from the continental shelf. This proved that the particles transported from the continental shelf and coast due to these tropical cyclones can travel far distances, reaching the deep ocean. But it's not just the amount of particles that reach the deep ocean what is important, but also the composition. With this event, for example, there was a huge increase of carbonates and particulate organic carbon, here I put it POC, of a particle range reaching down to the deep ocean. And actually, the carbonate fluxes measured at both depths, here in light blue 1500 meters and in dark blue is 3200 meter depth, were comparable to the annual ocean carbon flux for this region. But this just happened in 2-week period. Remember that the trap cups, the bottles, are a 2-week period. So it means that just in 2 weeks, there was an injection of carbon down to the deep ocean that will correspond basically in a year that it's not impacted by this hurricane. But you might be wondering now, what about the hurricanes or tropical cyclones, also that will be happening with the typhoons, that do not generate big resuspension of sediments from the coastline and continental shelf? And the ones that also like just track over the open ocean, do they have an impact in the deep ocean and deep ocean ecosystems? That's why I want to show you here an example of Hurricane Nicole that impacted Bermuda in 2016, but there was no big plume of sediments, as you can see here in these satellite images. If we observe now, for example, the transport of carbon that reached both the 1500 meter and 3200 meter sediment trap, you can see that there was not an obvious increase neither in carbonates or particulate organic carbon after or during the impact of Nicole in Bermuda. Both hurricanes generated a strong current resulting in a decrease in the sea surface temperature, and also then this triggered an upwelling of nutrients, inducing a phytoplankton bloom, as you can see here with these satellite images and satellite data. And actually during Nicole, as you can see with this chlorophyll map, the one on the right bottom, it was even more obvious this chlorophyll bloom following the hurricane path. But did these upper ocean conditions somehow impacted the carbon export and deep ocean ecosystem? Since, as I showed you, there was no obvious changes in the particles that reached down to the deep ocean with the elemental data. To answer this question, I want to show you the lipid content from the sinking particles before, during, and after Nicole impact, and how this compared to this other very different hurricane that will be Fabian. And you might be wondering why I use lipids among the several other proxies that are available and I could use. And this is because you will see that they are great tracers to evaluate how fresh is the material and also the sources of the particulate organic carbon. And therefore, they are great to trace sources and transport of and to evaluate the transport of tropical cyclone bloom products down to the deep ocean, and investigate the production and recycling of the particulate organic carbon. But just recap for a second and just think about, but what are lipids? Lipids are organic compounds that contain hydrogen, carbon, and oxygen atoms and are the foundation for the structure and function of living cells. While the primary function of lipids is long-term energy storage, lipids are also used for protection and insulation and lubrication, and also as precursors for hormones, and of course they are the key component of the membrane cells. And I'm sure you heard about the called omega-3 oils. Omega-3 oils are polyunsaturated fatty acids. Fatty acids are a part of the triglycerides and phospholipids. And omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids are characterized by the presence of a double bond 3 atoms away from the terminal methyl group in their chemical structure. That's why they are called omega-3. And they are widely distributed in the nature, being very important constituents of animals and lipid metabolisms. So among other lipids, we can know and learn a lot about the ecosystem functioning and carbon cycle in the ocean by knowing the abundance and composition of compounds like the omega-3 fatty acids and in the particles that sink through the water column also. There are hundreds of lipid compounds in the oceanic particulate organic carbon. However, certain lipids can be used as tracers to know how fresh the material is and to track the sources. Like if it's coming from the surface, we can track back just compounds that we'll find in the surface because they are very fresh. And if we have like episodic events like hurricanes, if there is like a huge arrival of and rapid arrival of material down to the deep ocean, we will know it. What I want to show you here is the relative contribution of phytoplankton, zooplankton, and bacteria to the particulate organic carbon that was exported to the deep ocean before, during, and after the Nicole hurricane and Fabian, estimated by key lipid biomarkers. I don't pretend you to learn and understand all the specific compounds, but for example, certain polyunsaturated fatty acids, as I was mentioning, for example, the omega-3 or some phytosterols or alkanones are associated with phytoplankton and label material, while, for example, some other saturated fatty acids or monosaturated fatty acids and alcohols and cholesterol, which I'm sure you heard about, are mainly indicative of zooplankton animal-derived. And other lipids like out-branch fatty acids and fatty alcohols and opanoids are useful to trace back the microbial communities. So just stick with the colors. Green will be phytoplankton, zooplankton will be orange, and bacteria will be pink. If we observe the arrival of lipids to the deep ocean at 1500 meters and at 3200 meters before Nicole, within the 2-week period that Nicole impacted, which is like here I mark with this red tropical cyclone symbol, when Nicole impacted, and after the period that Nicole impacted, here in the left y-axis is in black the total lipids, and in the right y-axis is the lipid flux for phytoplankton in green, zooplankton in orange, and bacterial derived in pink lipid fluxes. What we can clearly see is that there was an increase in lipid fluxes at both depths, with a time lag at 3200 meters. And this time lag actually is consistent with the sinking speed of the particles. And the formation of this kind of aggregates that I show you in images that we took and in the upper ocean, what they do is they accelerate the arrival of these bloom-derived materials down to the deep ocean because they increase the speed of the material. What this data indicate is that there was an increase of the fresh phytoplankton in the upper ocean, but and also this part of it was transferred down to the deep ocean, but also this stimulated zooplankton and bacteria-derived material and activity down to the deep ocean, which suggests that the upper ocean physical perturbation associated with tropical cyclones can stimulate the export of fresh material to the deep ocean, but also stimulate the zooplankton and microbial communities down to the deep ocean. If we now compare Nicole with the impact of Fabian, and remember that we're very different in terms of the total particles that arrive to the deep ocean, and then we compare the 1500 meters and a 3200 meter depth, what is very interesting is that although in terms of total particle mass flux we're very different, by observing the lipid fluxes, we can see that Fabian has the same order of magnitude of export of fresh material down to the deep ocean, with fluxes of lipid diagnostic of fresh phytoplankton and label particulate organic carbon, which is the green line, increasing at both 1500 meters and at 3200 meter depth, again with a 2-week time lag at 3200 meter depth. The results highlight the rapid export and disaggregation of this surface bloom-derived material and an increase in the animal and bacteria-derived biomass and activity in the deep ocean after a tropical cyclone passage. So to conclude, we can conclusively say that the extreme weather events can impact both the coastal ecosystem and deep ocean ecosystems, and they play an active role in carbon cycle and sediment processes and the ecosystem dynamics. We know that hurricanes passing the coastal can mix the water column and resuspend massive volumes of sediments, and this actually can have an impact in these ecosystems, and also that there is an impact due to the heavy rain due to the river discharge, and this actually can impact the quality of the water quality of these ecosystems. But we still have a lot of unknowns in coastal ecosystems, like what will be the long-term effect of these extreme weather events, when these, if these events impact more frequently or not, and if these actually might be reshaping or not the communities that live in these ecosystems. And especially in the deep ocean, we still have a lot of unknowns. Although we prove now that it seems that there is a direct impact down to the deep ocean, we still have a lot of questions to answer. And one of the big questions now is that if the ocean response that I just showed you are typical or not with all tropical cyclones, and which is the actual impact of this effect that we are seeing. And we are actually, this is an ongoing investigation, and we are now actually evaluating the impact of 15 hurricanes in the North Atlantic and comparing how these signals are different or similar, and hope that this will help to provide insight about the role of tropical cyclones in the global carbon cycle and how they are impacting the deep ocean ecosystems. And I hope to compare this with extreme weather events in other regions and how they compare with typhoons and cyclones as well, and how they are impacting marine ecosystems in different areas. And I just want to thank you all and thank all my collaborators and students that work with me in this research, and of course also like to MBL and BIOS and NSF. And thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you, Doctor. That was really an interesting presentation, and we have a number of questions that came in prior to the event and a few that came in during the event. I'm sure we'll have more, and we welcome those. The first question that I have from one of the audience members, which I thought was an interesting one to consider, is what are the conditions of prehistoric oceans? Like, do we know whether cyclones existed and hurricanes and typhoons existed by looking at the Earth and any impact that those events might have had on the Earth?
Yes, that's a very good question. So one of the things that paleoceanographers can do, for example, is to collect, as I was showing, like these big sediment cores of the seafloor. And thanks to this kind of collection, we can evaluate a lot the climate of the past and the processes that were happening on the past. what happens, as I was showing, with hurricanes and tropical cyclones in general and typhoons, is that there is this huge resuspension of materials and huge erosion. So we can track back this kind of erosion with sampling these sediments and knowing that there was an impact in the seafloor, for example, due to this process. Of course, we cannot specifically know the tracks of the hurricane from 300 years ago, or even like 1,000 years ago, but we can use these tools and techniques to estimate the processes that were happening hundreds of years ago.
Excellent. That same audience member had another interesting question. I'll address it right away, which was, how long does it take for the microbial composition to return to normal after a cyclone event?
That's a very good question, and it's a bit out of my research. So basically, the microbial communities, when these cyclones happen, what they do is they take the opportunity to use food availability, for example, that was not there before. So what could happen is that the structure of the microbial community could change in a way that some of them get more benefits from the arrival of this material versus other ones they will not use it. So you'll have this kind of transition from one microbial community versus like the other, but I'm not sure the timing in when they will get, like restored.
I see. And Brenda asked, if greenhouse gases can be reduced, can tropical cyclone activities effectively also be reduced?
So what we are seeing is that as the CO2 increases in the atmosphere and there is a temperature rise, we know that the intensity of these tropical cyclones are increasing. It means that if we stop this increase of CO2 and therefore warming ocean, then it means that this intensity of tropical cyclones also that could be mitigated, I think.
Great, thank
But
you.
they will still exist, basically, but maybe not
Which
that
is
strong.
tied to a question I had from off of your presentation, just the frequency, the number of cyclone events in this part of the world, you said was greater than what we typically see in the Americas. Why is that?
Because the Pacific Ocean, the temperatures are warmer, so the moisture and condition and atmospheric patterns facilitate the formation of typhoons more than over other areas. So basically, for example, if you compare with the Atlantic versus the Northeast Pacific and the Northwest Pacific, the conditions, atmospheric conditions, coupled with the temperature conditions in the surface ocean, is helping to develop all these typhoons.
I see. And this question is specifically directed at South China's coastal cities, but maybe I'll ask it more broadly. Is there anything that we as human beings can do to mitigate the risks of tropical cyclones and typhoons?
I guess, like in terms of coastal management and things like that, it's being aware where the storm surge to start with can arrive, and also if there are ecosystems that can be impacted because of these ecosystems, be mindful of potential impacts once the currents arrive, the wind will arrive. So basically try to put some management tools to be ready when this extreme forcing arrives.
And I'm curious whether or not these kinds of cyclone events are at all related, and if you as scientists have correlated them with the drought conditions that we're seeing in many parts of the world, in the Western United States and in Australia and other places.
I mean, not in my opinion. I think not per se, but it's all linked to climate change because I mean, see, if we have more intense tropical cyclones, we have also due to the climate change more water availability. So there are like glacier retreats or warming ocean. So everything is linked to this pattern with increasing the CO2 in the atmosphere.
Will we start to see with global warming and the Arctic ice melting, glaciers melting, will we see more of this kind of activity in parts of the world we've never seen it before?
You mean like tropical cyclones or?
Yeah. Yes.
So basically, what it's been evaluated is that the areas where these tropical cyclones can form and even travel, they are expanding because the surface ocean, it's warming more in areas than usually was not as warm, that usually they will just basically stop because they cannot be energy fitted. um, so it means that potentially areas that were not affected by these events eventually could be affected because there is this expansion of tropical cyclone activity.
That is a little bit related to one of the audience questions, which I find really interesting. So I want to ask you, do marine animals sense these tropical cyclone events and typhoons in advance of them occurring?
Well, the capacity that the animals have is amazing. So basically, I'm not like 100% familiar with this, but for example, with this study that was published related with fish species, they adapt very quick. Well, adapt like migrate very quickly when they have the perception that the strong currents are coming. So it's possible that they know even prior to the strong current being in there that they have to evacuate, or and same will happen with other animals, that they have the sense that they need to protect themselves and even migrate to areas that potentially is not their area of comfort in the ocean, because as we know, the ocean has different pressure at different depths. So basically, if they sometimes they are, for example, used to live at 30 meters, from 30 to 100, maybe they are pushed themselves to go down deeper depths just for protecting themselves.
Related to that question is another question that relates to fish and whether they can adjust or adapt themselves to global warming as a whole or any other natural calamities. Are we seeing ocean life adapt to climate change? And is it related to the answer that you just gave?
So the direct impact, for example, that we are seeing also with ocean acidification due to the increase of CO2 in the oceans, we are seeing that they are being affected also like the shell formation of certain animals. But I don't know the answer related with long-term adaptation to climate change, since I think we need more years to honestly see the long-term effect of certain stressors. But I'm sure there are other colleagues that will answer better this.
Great. One audience member asked about whether reef ecosystems buffer the organic flux characteristic of cyclonic events. And if yes, are there estimates available on the extent of the buffer that the reef can provide?
You mean in terms of protecting the coastal erosion and then coastal ecosystems?
Yes. Yes.
They so basically they get impacted also by these currents. They are kind of like strong ecosystems in a way that they hold like a lot of biodiversity and different animals that can protect themselves in this reef. The only thing is that when the currents are too strong, let's say with certain tropical cyclones, this can impact and basically break apart part of the coral reefs and transport these coral reefs down to deeper oceans, and this will trigger, that they will need several years to restore this ecosystem to have the capability again to be a part of this kind of a protection of the whole ecosystem.
Mm. And one audience member asked whether there are already evidence that tropical cyclones can trigger harmful algae blooms. I know algae blooms are issues around the world and South America and various parts of the world that also affect our marine life.
Yes, there are evidence, and there are evidence like when there is this huge injection of nutrients in the upper ocean, then it means that there is a lot of availability of nutrients that can be used for the all the plankton algae communities, and it has been seen that this huge arrival of nutrients sometimes trigger these harmful algae blooms that then has to be dealt with especially like impacting the ecosystems and also the population that live nearby.
We're getting close to the top of the hour here. I'll maybe ask you one more question, and we can conclude the program. And I don't know if this is your area of expertise, but one of the audience members asked, can you comment on how coastal shipping infrastructure interferes with the carbon cycle on the coast? Is that a fair question to ask?
What I know, and I did some research in the Mediterranean Sea too, is that the shipping through ships, what they cause is actually some petroleum pollution, unfortunately. So because they actually you can by sampling also the water in the surface and also like below the surface. You can evaluate the pollutants that you have in the water, and one of the things that we can see is that the areas that are highly impacted by shipping, they have more pollution derived from these fossil fuels use. So basically related with the shipping, the impact that they have, it's one of the, I'm sure there are other things, but one of the things that is impacted is due to this delivery of pollutants in marine ecosystems, although they are getting better. But you can see that areas that are highly impacted and highly used, basically just analyzing these pollutants, you could track all the roads basically that they are using to go from one point to another one.
Kind of related to that question, the question just came in. Is it true that slow-moving typhoons induce phytoplankton blooms of higher chlorophyll? Maybe I'll just stop the question there because, again, that's a fairly specific question, but related to the one I just asked.
This is a very, very good question, and I'm working on this actually because sometimes typhoons, hurricanes, cyclones that have a lower category, so less intense, if they go slower, what I'm seeing is that actually they have more impact because they spend more time in the surface. So basically, they can generate more resuspension, more injection of nutrients, more impact in the upper ocean activity. So that's a very good question.
Mm-hmm. Great. One question, one area we didn't cover, sufficiently, I think, which you may want to comment on, and we were talking about this before the program, is, the great plastic islands that are out in the Pacific Ocean and elsewhere around the world. Can you speak to plastics as it relates to how our oceans are being damaged?
Yes, so there is a lot of pollution in the ocean, as you all know, and there are like millions of tons delivered each year. And what we are trying to investigate now is that trying to account for how much actually gets delivered to the marine ecosystem, and also like we are trying to evaluate like where is this plastic going, because we know the waste that we are producing, we more or less know the amount that it gets delivered to the ocean. But when we do the surveying of the surface ocean, what we are noticing is that the numbers are not like what we were expecting. So basically, it said that 99% of the plastic that actually we were expecting there, it cannot be accounted for. So it means that either these plastic debris that continuously keep breaking down are being transported down to the deep ocean, or they are being consumed by some animals, or they are being degraded. So actually here at MBL we are working with this, and in the North Atlantic we put it some incubation units with different plastics to evaluate if we are observing plastic degradation in the deep ocean, and this will help us to understand if the microbial communities that are living in the deep ocean actually can use this plastic carbon as an energy source, and then will help us to explain the carbon, the plastic budget overall, and where is this plastic going, and also like ways to mitigate this problem, because plastics are being spread like everywhere.
I keep saying last question, but one more question
Yeah, no problem.
that comes to mind. You know, I was wondering if your scientific community has a hierarchy of issues in a priority that says these are the things that damage the ocean most. You know, we're talking about tropical cyclones. We're talking about plastic and nanoplastics and microplastics. We're talking about bleaching coral. We're talking about things like overfishing. Do you have any kind of hierarchy of the things that are impacting the ocean the most?
The thing is that we, as a scientist, try to understand every like parameter in the ocean, because if we were just focusing in one thing, then we will not understand. For example, if we were just focusing on plastics, but not, for example, the ocean currents and the temperature changes and everything, we will not understand where the plastics are going, for example, and why. So basically, even if there are like a huge priority list of pollutants and plastics and CO2 exchange and how this change, and we try to have, you know, our mind open for evaluate the ecosystem as a whole, not just like one single parameter, because otherwise we will be missing the big picture of what's happening. And also there are always new things coming, so we try to, even if we are focusing in plastics or carbon cycle or how nutrients are delivered, we try to account everything that we can.
Well, we as human beings, you know, because we're land animals, we tend to focus on air. And I'm wondering from your perspective, should we be focusing more of our attention on the oceans as opposed to the air? Which is doing more damage, or are they both sort of equal as part of this whole, you know, global system, earthly system we live in?
I think so. I think they are equal, and actually, what's very important too is to evaluate the coupling between the atmosphere and the ocean and how they are connected, because everything is connected, and sometimes we forget how tightly connected the atmosphere and the ocean is, and it seems like very far away, like 4,500 meters of water. It seems like very far away, and kind of like we don't have an impact down there, but we do. And even, you know, like if we evaluate the dynamics of the atmosphere, we will also understand better what's happening down to the deep ocean, because everything is interconnected. So I think it's very important to evaluate aerosols, dynamic patterns of the atmosphere, and also like how this gets translated to the ocean, chemical, physical, biology properties of marine ecosystems, because they are very interconnected.
Excellent. Dr. Pedrosa Pàmies, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was really fascinating, and I hope we can have you back again sometime soon.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Our pleasure too. And I think more of us, after watching this program, will spend a little bit more time thinking about oceans and the impact that climate change is having on our oceans. We do have a brief poll for you tonight from this program for the audience on Zoom. You can scroll through your cursor to see the entire responses to the second question, but we'd appreciate it if you would answer the poll to give us a little bit of data. And while you're answering the poll, I'm going to tell you a bit more about Uncampus upcoming events. So next week, we'll take a short break and come back on July 22nd with another Pop Asia mini-series. It's going to be fun, and it's kind of a summer fun event, and I hope that your whole family can enjoy, and especially the young ones. It's called the Korean Wave, and we're going to talk about things like Korean drama and K-pop and the like. We're having a lot of fun putting that program together. So make sure to check out our Facebook page as well as the Uncampus website to register for our Korean Wave mini-series. And we look forward to seeing you again on July 22nd. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.